You're listening to 106.2 FM IDC Radio. This is a very special show, our first one of a series of programs where we are going to be hosting professors, doctors, academics, experts in the field of terrorism, going to speak with us with some of the master's students in the Counter-Terrorism program here at the IDC in partnership with the ICT. And our first guest honoring us with his presence here in the studio is Professor Dr. Boaz Ganor, founder and executive director of the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism, the Ronald Lauder Chair for Counter-Terrorism, and Dean of the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy at the IDC. Professor Ganor, how are you doing today?
Very well. I'm enjoying very much. Thank you for having me here, Itai.
Thank you so much for joining us as well. We should let our listeners know we are joined by one of the excellent master's students here at the IDC, and that is Samantha Greenberg. How are you doing today, Sam?
I am very well, and I'm very excited to be here. Thank you.
So we have quite the panel. We have quite the discussion ahead of us here on this wonderful new program that we are doing here. And let's kick things off right away. Professor Ganor, we've heard you speak quite a bit at conferences, on television, radio, classes, in your books, articles, about the importance of the definition of terrorism. And as of yet, there's still no agreed international definition for terrorism, and it seems to be complicating matters. Could you explain to us why you feel there needs to be an international definition to the word terrorism, and what would you suggest to the world?
You know, Itai, I'm teaching the subject matter of terrorism for almost 25 years altogether. And in order not to get tired myself from the subject, I change it all the time. I try to be more relevant to the changing events and so on and so forth. So I have this lecture, which is the lecture that I give to the public at large usually. And this lecture of today, I call it The Art of Counterterrorism. Because I tend to believe that counterterrorism is a profession. It's not being regarded as such, but it's a profession. And it's a little bit even more than a profession. This is an art. Because if you really want to be effective in counterterrorism, you need to have the skills of an artist. Meaning you need to find the right doses, the right balances between conflicting calculations, between different approaches, dilemmas, challenges, and so on and so forth. I think that the first pillar of this art of counterterrorism is to agree on one subject matter. Who's the enemy and what is the enemy? And it's weird that after so many years, so many scholars around the world, so many people which are engaged in the field of counterterrorism. So much money is being poured to counterterrorism and so on and so forth, but the basic, we don't agree on that. What is terrorism? And if there's something which is a common denominator for decision makers, for legal experts, for scholars around the world, is that we never can reach an objective definition of the term. Why? Because it's too politicized, because this is a subjective term, because one man's terrorist, of course, is another man's freedom fighter. Anyone who attacks me is a terrorist, and anyone who's doing the same thing to my enemy, this is a freedom fighter. On the face of it, it sounds reasonable. The other argument that those people that stand against the definition of terrorism says we don't really need that because we actually are succeeding to deal with terrorism quite effectively, even have international cooperation without agreeing on the definition of terrorism. If we will outlaw what the terrorists are doing, we don't need to define who are the terrorists. Meaning, if we will outlaw hijacking or suicide attacks or kidnappings, that's good enough. We can all agree that this is forbidden. I beg to differ. I think that all of that could have been right for a decade ago, 2 decades ago. The level and the intensity of terrorism today, the challenge that terrorism poses to the international community today, there is no one state which is immune to this threat today. In that level, we need to change the disc in our head. We need, for example, how can we outlaw a terrorist organization if we don't agree? What is terrorism? Then what happens is that Israel refers to Hamas as a terrorist organization, but Erdogan doesn't. And Erdogan refers to the PKK as terrorist, but United States do not. So that's a chaotic situation. How can we have laws that will outlaw incitement for terrorism, if we don't agree what is terrorism altogether, and so many other aspects. So I would argue that the challenge of terrorism today forces us to unite after one objective definition of the term. And since you've asked me, I will just mention it without getting into a full course on what's the definition of terrorism. The definition that I use is a very simple and precise and I believe objective and very short. One message I would give to our audience, the viewers and the listeners, is if you get to know, read or listen to a very long definition of terrorism, you can already know, even without getting into the definition itself, that this is trying to turn around and have shortcuts and not really deal with the subject matter itself. Terrorism, under the definition that I use, is the following one. This is the deliberate use of violence aimed against civilians or civilian targets in order to achieve political ends. So it has three pillars: the use of violence, the intentional use of violence aimed against civilian targets, and different in order to achieve different political goals. You immediately can understand that deliberate attack against military targets do not fall into the definition of terrorism. I don't legitimize them, God forbid, but I see this as a different phenomenon. This is guerrilla warfare. And anyone who attacks my soldiers is my enemy, and I have all the right to fight back, if necessary, even to kill him in order to prevent those attacks against my soldiers. But I see it totally different from the moral aspect when somebody deliberately attacks military targets and deliberately attacks civilian kids, kindergartens, schools, and so on and so forth.
So right away, you can see the major difference based on your definition, and it sort of while it clarifies everything, at least in my mind, and I think a lot of the listeners' mind, then two real immediate questions pop up into my mind when listening to that. First and foremost is, what makes it then, in your opinion, such a simplistic, perfect definition, in my opinion, for what terrorism is, makes it so difficult for the world to agree that that's probably the most useful definition for terrorism? And second of all, when you brought up about the attacking of soldiers, what about suicide bombers that go and just blow up soldiers? Is that an act of terrorism based on the method used to attack the soldiers?
So I'll start with the second question. No, suicide attack, as you said, it's a method. It's a method that can be used in different situations. So it might be that terrorists are using suicide attacks against civilian targets, and it might be that guerrillas are using suicide attacks against military targets. And what about a soldier of a state? Take, for example, Iran, a case that occurred in the past. Iranian soldiers serves as suicide attackers in a military battlefield. Is this terrorism? No, it has nothing to do with terrorism. This is a certain modus operandi. Now, the question, as you asked it, if it's so simple, why people doesn't adopt it? Because it's very convenient for decision makers, for politicians all over the world, not to agree on a definition of terrorism. Because then, exactly, you can support those that you define them as freedom fighter or not as terrorists, and you can condemn those that are fighting against you as terrorists. Very convenient. It is convenient, but it's not efficient. So I don't know if I'm optimistic or pessimistic by saying, as many Americans know the saying, read my lips. At the end of the day, the international community will adopt a definition. My definition, a different definition, slightly different, doesn't really matter. It will be adopted. Why I'm so convinced? Because I know, based on my analysis, terrorism is not just here to stay. When I say here, I refer to the global arena. It's not just here to stay. It's here to grow. It's going to grow. It's going to deteriorate. It's going to use in the future non-conventional methods, chemical terrorism, maybe even biological terrorism. At that time, there will not be any more room for double language, double policy, for putting unrelevant interest or less relevant interest of a state, like economical interest, good diplomatic relations, and other interests, in a higher consideration than counterterrorism and security. At that time, I believe that we would see the international community unified and united behind one acceptable definition of the term.
I have a question building
Yes,
upon
Samantha.
your definition. Despite all the violence conducted in the name of Islam, we see Western states hesitant to call it Islamic terrorism, or investigations have been limited or canceled in fear of being perceived as racist or anti-Islamic. The Orlando shooter was on an FBI watch list and then taken off. Even the Paris and Brussels attackers were known to law enforcement as extremists. Authorities know people who are radicalizing. They know people have ties with terrorist organizations overseas. And far too often we see people known to law enforcement committing acts of terrorism. When do you think is an appropriate time in this process for law enforcement to take action? And do you think political correctness plays a role in no action, or even worse, counteraction by law enforcement agencies?
Well, as my student, you know that I have a lot of criticism towards political correctness and terrorism. I have a lot of criticism towards the current American administration and some European leaders. But I would like to start from the opposite position. I do understand them. Take, for example, President Obama. Okay, I do understand the policy of President Obama. President Obama rightly so understand that effective counterterrorism needs to deal simultaneously with countering the operational capability of the terrorists, i.e. fight them, no other way, if necessary to kill them or to arrest them or to confiscate their possessions and so on and so forth. And he's doing that. Nobody can say differently. He's the one that was responsible to the killing of bin Laden, for example, and many other occurrences. But he also understands, and very well understands, the need to to diminish the motivation that gives birth to terrorism. It seems to me that he gives more emphasis on counter-motivation than countering operational capability, and even on that I cannot criticize him, because it's fair. I do also believe in the need to counter-motivation. Now the question is, how do you do that? And how do you do this effectively? Because we share the same goal. We understand, A, that we have a problem that has to do with Salafist, jihadist, Islamists that are misinterpreting Islam in order to provoke terrorism and violence. We do understand that. Now the question is, how do you counter that? How do you bring the counter narrative for that? And even not less important, I wanted to say more important, but it's not, no less important, is how, while doing that, we do not push moderate Muslims to defend, so-called defend their position by the fact that they feel being attacked by Westerners, by United States, by Israelis, by whoever altogether. The solution that he have chosen is the solution of I don't want to say appeasement, but political correctness, shying out of the term terrorism, shying out of the connection between terrorism and Islam, and so on and so forth. I don't think it serves very well. I don't see the success of de-radicalization of those extremists. I don't see the prevention of radicalization based on that. So what could have been the alternative? For that, let me share with you an anecdote. I was invited to give a talk in Brussels quite a few years ago. And before my talk, there was another speaker there. It was an imam coming from Sudan, I believe. And he was very articulated in English, very smart, very moderate. And he was approaching the European audience and told them, how dare you refer to Islam as if it is something to do with terrorism? Do you know what Islam is all about? Islam is the religion of peace and clemency. You are using the term jihadi terrorism all the time. Do you know what jihad is all about? Jihad is all about doing good deeds and not those atrocities. He was very persuasive. And then was my turn. He was still in the room. So in the opening lecture of mine, I approached him personally and I said, my friend, let me thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I sincerely mean that you took the trouble to fly all over the way from your country to Brussels to share with us, non-Muslim, I'm a Jew, most of the people in the crowd are Christians, to share with us this important message that Islam is the religion of peace and clemency, that jihad has nothing to do with terrorism. It's crucial for us to understand that. But between you and me, I don't really understand why they do bother to fly all over the way up here to tell those two messages to us instead of staying in your country or crossing to Yemen, to Afghanistan, to Iraq, I can mention so many countries, and tell those people which are beheading innocent civilians, conducting huge terrorist atrocities under the name of Islam, raising the flag of jihad, what they do is against Islamic concept and jihadi verdicts. I cannot do that. I'm a Jew. Nobody in the room can do that. You should not waste 1 minute of your life of persuading us that this is the case. I believe you. You have to persuade those people, your own people. And you know why? Not because you need to make any favors to me, to the Western countries, because you need to save your religion, what you believe in, what we just now told us. You need to save it from being hijacked by those jihadist Salafists that actually misinterpret your religion and buying the hearts and minds of larger populations all the time. Still, thanks God, they are a small minority within the Muslim world, but it's growing. And the only one who can win this war, the narrative war, are the Muslims themselves. Now, going back to President Obama, the question, what should President Obama do? Should he say, it has nothing to do with Islam, it has nothing to do with jihad, and so on and so forth? Or posing this challenge, as I just suggested, to the moderate Muslims and say, go, do something about it. We are here to help. Any help you need, just let us know. The slogan that I would use in this regard is, God forbid, nobody has a problem with Islam. Islam is a religion like any other religion and should be respected at least like any other religion. But there is a problem in Islam right now. A small portion of Islam, but there is a problem in Islam, and we should not turn a blind eye to this specific problem.
In addition to what you were saying there, you have majority of the people killed in terrorist attacks today are Muslim people. It's Muslims that are dying at the hands of terrorism the most of anyone in the world.
Right.
So in addition to what you were saying about needing to change the narrative, and as the anecdote you were saying, and Islam is a religion of peace and clemency. Having said all that, what does it take then to understand that the Western countries, for example, the United States and Russia and them, are out to get these terrorists that are in your country? Why do you see these people like this imam coming to the Western world to yell at them that Islam is not the problem, that it's a few small people within Islam, but Islam is okay? Why don't we see the people turning to their own communities and saying, because it seems like it's a silent majority in all of these countries where radicals are now taking over. The Islamic State is not just any terrorist group. They have established borders for themselves. They are trying to create economic means for themselves. Iran itself is the largest state sponsor of terrorism, and radicals are at the highest levels of their government. But the majority of Iranians, I wouldn't say, are radicals. Where does the disconnect happen between these radicals and the silent majority?
I think that there are a few answers to this question. One answer is you need to be very, very brave as a Muslim to stand against this dangerous trend. You are right, it's still a small minority, but a very dangerous one. And there were brave Muslims, including religious clerics, that pay a high price, even in their life, for doing that. So some prefer to shy out. They don't believe in those issues. If they are being asked, maybe they say so, but they're not taking a loudspeaker and go to persuade the Muslim masses on that. The other reason is that those activists that in my humble view, misinterpret Islam and use those fatwas and phrases within the Quran, maybe phrases coming from Muhammad himself, in order to provoke people to conduct extreme violence and terrorist activity and atrocities like ISIS is doing against Muslims and against others. They cling to a certain interpretation of Islam. And like those Salafists, they actually refers to themselves as the pure Islam. They are the real thing. You know, it's the advertisement of Coca-Cola for so many years was we are the real thing, compared to Pepsi, of course. Those elements refers to themselves as the real thing, and they bring many arguments why their interpretation of Islam is the right interpretation of Islam. I believe they are wrong. I believe that most of the Muslims around the world understand that they are wrong, but sometimes religious clerics and lay people and decision makers within the Muslim and the Arab world find it difficult to contend with their arguments. So you need to be brave, you need to be smart, and you need to know the Quran and to know the Islam very well in order to give the other and the right and the just translation and the interpretation of the religion.
Before Sam gets on to our next question, I want to tie into it with the problem that you have brought up around the world is the necessity for a network to beat a network. That the terrorist groups right now are networked by communications, by financing, whatever it be. You can have a headquarters like Al-Qaeda that's sitting in Afghanistan and groups from around the world all communicating as a network. You have mentioned the need for a global network to attack and defeat this terrorist network in conjunction. It seems, though, as based on your original comments on the definition and why it's difficult to agree upon a definition, is again convenience. So I wanted to ask, why not build regional networks that could work together? When you look at it from Western Europe perspective, I don't think anyone in Brussels or Paris or London or Washington have really any delusions of what they're up against, but they also know that that's different than what the Chinese and the Russians and maybe Middle Eastern countries are dealing with. So why not look at it on a regional level, first of all, with people that could agree together on what their definition is and to build a network to at least defeat parts of the terrorist network?
First of all, I buy it. It's not in contradiction, of course, to the global network that we're discussing. The global network should, of course, be based on local networks altogether. But I have maybe news for you that I didn't share in class because it's new news for you. Terrorism is evolving. And we need to understand terrorism as an evolving phenomenon, very dynamic. Whatever we learn about terrorism today, hopefully it's true for today. Nobody tells us that this would be true for tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. So about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, most of the terrorist attacks were organized attacks, meaning there was an organization behind the attack. An organization initiated the attack. An organization planned the attack, prepared the attack, and activists of the organization executed the attack. When you have organized terrorism, you can develop certain doctrines in order to prevent those attacks, in order to contend with and to counter this phenomenon of organized terrorism. After 9/11, we saw the evolution of global terrorism because there was a hunt down on those organizations led by United States. And what you saw is more local networks popping up, having some connection between the activists and between the networks themselves, and creating this global network of terrorism or global jihadi terrorism, if you wish. And then I was definitely arguing that it's crucial to beat the global jihadi network with a global counter-terrorism network, and I do agree it should be based on local networks, as, by the way, the global jihadi network is being constructed. But I think now that we are facing a third stage of this evolution, which leads us to a different, not instead of the rest of the two, but on top of that. And what we see now is the growing phenomenon of homegrown terrorism and lone wolves. And in this case, I think that it's not enough anymore to build the global network to beat the network, because what we need is to build the global society to defeat those elements within the society which being radicalized and becoming terrorists. Something I want to suggest to my students and my colleagues and my friends is actually to start to create this global counter-terrorism society. It's not that complicated today when we are dealing with social networks, with the internet, and so on and so forth. We can do that, and it's more amoeboidic than even networks are. But it's necessary to do so. I think that there is a common denominator for so many people around the world: Muslims, Christians, Jews, any other religion that you have in mind, coming from all the continent, that they really stand against terrorism, any type of terrorism. They really resent that. They understand that this is their goal for their own future and the future of their families and their kids, that they need to do something about it. They are not leaders. They are not CEO of companies. They are not scholars. They are simple people. But those simple people needs to unite to create the global counterterrorism society.
Speaking of lone wolf terrorism, you had mentioned in your article on Intifada in Europe that second and third generation Muslim immigrants are increasingly undergoing a radicalization process. The next round of Syrian immigrants are going to Clearwater, Florida. How can the local authorities prepare to assimilate them into the local community? And then the second part of the question, it regards the actual community. You had mentioned that public awareness is one of the most important factors in combating terrorism. Do you believe this plays a role in Clearwater? And if so, how can public awareness be increased?
Okay, so as for the first question, yes, in my research, which I published under the title Intifada in Europe, a few years ago, way before ISIS was even created, I have noted that I find that the main problem of homegrown terrorism in Europe comes from the second and the third generation of the immigrants, and in lesser capacity with the first generation. And I try to analyze why this is happening, and my conclusion was that who is the first generation? The first generation are two type of people. Those which are asylum seekers, political asylum seekers, those that were hunted in their homelands because of their political views, and those which wanted to improve their socioeconomical status. In both cases, maybe the biggest achievement in their lives was that they got the permission to immigrate to this or the other European country, and they were granted with the citizenship of this or the other country. I mean, on the day that they will die and they will report to themselves what is the biggest achievement that we had in life, this would be the biggest achievement. Of course, they came with different value system. They came with different political traditions, with different religion, with different points of views, interests, and so on and so forth. But still, there was always something that made it clear to them, we are in a much better situation than we used to be. And they still have ties with the families and the friends that stay there, knowing how unemployed they are, how prosecuted they are, and so on and so forth. And they are very satisfied with the situation. Although that if you analyze their situation from objective point of view, I mean, you come from Mars and you are looking on those immigrants in Europe, you say, wait a minute, they are not equal. They are probably in many cases second-class citizens. They are being employed, but with a very low income salaries. Usually the job market is what offered to them is what the locals doesn't want to work in, but still it's much, much better than it used to be, and they can always compare that. The second and the third generation have been born to a different situation. Nobody gave them any favor by granting them the citizenship of this or the other country. They feel second-class citizens. They see that they are. By the way, it's not just the government or the local population to blame. The two sides need to be blamed for that. The parents wanted to preserve, in many cases, ethnic and immigration enclaves. They didn't want to assimilate with the society, and the society didn't want them to be assimilated there, so it was convenient for everybody. It's not convenient for the second and the third generation that becomes very frustrated and very angry. By the way, angry on the country, angry on the population in the country, but also angry on their parents, because they look at the parents and they cannot comprehend how they do not see that they are second-class citizens, they are being treated differently, they don't have the same opportunities. So they are frustrated with the behavior of the parents, which cause also breakdown in the position of the mother and the father figure within the family altogether. This is orchestrated. It's not just a natural thing. It might be a natural thing, by the way, in every immigration community, not just Muslim immigration community. But in the Muslim immigration communities in Europe and in other places as well, it's being orchestrated by outsiders, by those people that we have discussed before that use different methods in order to provoke them, in order to actually intensify this frustration and track that into jihadist, Salafist, violent terrorist activity. So when you combine all of that, you understand why homegrown terrorism and foreign fighters today and others are mainly second and third generation of Muslim immigrants.
And so just to build off of Sam's question, what should local authorities then do to prepare the local communities to integrate together with the immigrants?
I think that the key factor is the word together. I mean, it's needed to be a decision of both sides. It's not enough that the government will do it utmost to integrate them, but they would still want to preserve their enclaves because of different reasons, and vice versa. They will be open up to the society, but the society would not want to integrate them. Well, it's a huge task. It would probably take decades, if not generation time, until, if the right thing will be conducted, the right measures will be taken, that this will be a successful outcome. But I'll give you maybe one example how I think one needs to think along those lines. I met a very distinguished politician in Australia quite a few years ago, and we spoke about this question about the integration, about the second generation terrorists. And at the end of our discussion, he said, I have now a request coming from the Muslim community in my constituency. And they asked me to donate $1 million Australian dollars to their education system, the Muslim community education system. If you would have been my advisor, what would be your recommendation? I said, how much money do they ask you? He said, $1 million. I said, don't give it to them. Give them $2 million, but not to their secluded Arabic-speaking, a separate education system which you don't have a clue what is being given there as education to the youngsters. Give them $2 million in scholarships to the best high schools, to the best universities you have. At least you would know that with your money, you contributed to the assimilation, you contributed to the integration of this society in your country. This is the kind of thinking I think that Western leaders should have in mind.
So when looking at that and seeing that Western leaders need to have this type of leadership, expanding on the fact that you said that this could take decades to do properly, something that I fear we do not have the time to do at this stage of the game. With the immigration coming out of the mass migration coming out of the Middle East, the largest since World War II of immigrants coming, we've seen a rise of radical parties in Europe. We've seen rise of anti-immigration slogans even in the United States, in Canada. Countries that are built on immigration and on people coming from around the world to contribute to their melting pot societies. When you examine that, I think that there's a disconnect right now between the societies and what could be down the road. Is what we're seeing is there is a lot of fear in the air of accepting these immigrants into their countries and integrating properly. How do we get over that fear for the local communities when right now, as we've seen, a lot of the terrorism that happens, a lot of the people that are attacked and killed are killed by Muslim immigrants or Muslim fighters from different groups. What we're seeing in Germany that happened over New Year's, of the reports coming out of sexual assaults by these immigrants, this is putting fear into the local population and sowing even more divide. What do the local authorities, governments have to do to tamper down that fear? Because, as we mentioned at the top of this program, not every Muslim is a terrorist. Not every immigrant is a foreign fighter. Not every immigrant that's coming is going to sexually assault you or hurt you. But it has happened, and it's sowed fear into the communities of Western Europe and the United States, Canada. What do we need to do to get over that, to help integrate the communities, to get to that stage that we were just speaking about?
First of all, it's never too late. It's a very long and difficult task, but it's never too late, and it's necessary. There is no other way. Let's make it clear. There is no other way. But I would differ between the Muslim communities which are already stationed and living in Europe and the new immigration, which is coming as an outcome of the civil war in Syria, in Iraq, and other places altogether. I do believe that Europe needs to rethink about the immigration policy of the country. I think that they need to have new rules, actually new laws. Who could get the permission to become an immigrant, an official immigrant, and get the citizenship, and who is not? One of the conditions, in my view, should be the fact that the candidate, the immigrant candidate, is accepting the values, this value system of that or the other society. If you want to build a caliphate state, excuse me, it's probably shouldn't be France and not Germany. You can do it in other places. Here, you need to adopt the liberal democratic constitution if you want to be part of it, and they should find a way to enforce that in this respect. The question is how to integrate those which are there and how not to cause this Islamophobic reaction. I have to say that when I'm talking to Muslims and when I try to persuade them in the need to save Islam from those Islamists and jihadists that are misusing Islam, I also use this argument, and I'm saying, look, this Islamophobic process that you start to see, unfortunately, getting stronger in Europe, in other places, even in the United States in a way. This is an outcome of the fact that you are shying out to stand against those people. And your role here is not just in order to save your religion from those dangerous people, but it's also actually to prevent this very dangerous trend among your new society which you are living in. So this is really a task that you need to take upon yourself with the help of the state, with the help of every civilized person.
Speaking of liberal democratic values, in your book Global Alert, you said that jihadi terrorist organizations see democracy as a means of promoting their own interests. For them, liberal democratic values are a state's soft underbelly, which they exploit to the detriment of the state. How do we make democracy stronger and harder for the terrorist organizations to exploit, while at the same time honoring the commitment to defend its citizens without sacrificing these core values?
My argument in Global Alert in the book is based on something which I refer to as misconception. All my American friends, I hope, will forgive me by saying mainly an American misconception. And by the way, I refer to a bipartisan misconception. It's not just the Democrats, it's also the Republicans. It used to be President Bush and Condoleezza Rice no less than President Obama. What do I mean by that? This is a false belief, in my view, that democracy is a miracle solution for violence and terrorism. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not supporting any other regime but democracy, liberal democracy. But we should acknowledge the soft bellies of this regime. We should acknowledge and react towards the challenges that democracy is facing when it's being attacked by terrorists. We need to understand, first and foremost, that democracy is not just free elections. Some people simplifies the nature of democracy. And then terrorist organizations are misusing that. For example, Hamas, for example, Hezbollah. They become what I define as a hybrid terrorist organization that control territory and control population. They are being embedded within the population, the society, and they take an active role in the politics of this entity, and they participate in the election. They are being elected either to the parliament or even becoming the government, and then the world, the Western world, start to be confused. What are they? What is Hezbollah? How can we refer to Hezbollah as a terrorist organization? Now, excuse me. What about ISIS? ISIS is a hybrid terrorist organization who control both territory and population. Now, I don't know if Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is listening to my interview or not, but if I would be his advisor, I would suggest to him to conduct free election, actually to bring over UN spectators that they will see that there is no gun pointing to the head of his own constituency. I tend to believe that he will win the election in the territory that he controls. And then what? Is he legitimized? Is it a state that need to be regarded as such? No, it's a hybrid terrorist organization that took over territory and population and hijacked them. In a way, they created a local Stockholm effect, in which the person is trusting, sometimes even falling in love with the kidnapper. That's the situation right there. So the people in Gaza are voting for Hamas because they are having the same type of this effect. It doesn't legitimize Hamas. It will legitimize Hamas once Hamas will stand forward and say, we have done an enormous mistake. We deliberately attacked civilians. We regret that. We would never do this again. We might still fight Israel, but we will never, ever deliberately attack Israeli or any other civilians anymore. Then it will be changed altogether. So what I'm trying to say is the democracy is very fragile in this regard. You know, we are using the term asymmetric warfare time and again. Asymmetric warfare. Now, when I say asymmetric warfare, what popped to your mind, I need to ask you, but I would say it for you. This is the biblical story of David and Goliath. What is more asymmetric warfare than David and Goliath? But practically, it's true. The state, the weakest state on earth, is much stronger than the stronger terrorist organization on earth. So the state is the Goliath, and the David, unfortunately, is the terrorist organization. But when we are talking about liberal democracy as the state, then it's not this asymmetric situation between Goliath, the monstrous 2.5 meters high monster, weaponized up to his teeth, fighting against this small shepherd that has only stone to defend himself. It's not the case, because this Goliath, the state, is handcuffed in its hand and shackled in his leg while fighting this lunatic David that doesn't give a damn about those values, and those values that shackle the state, and actually identify them and misuse them against the state. Bringing us to the beginning of our discussion. How do you balance between those challenges? That's the art of counterterrorism. This is something that can and should be learned. That's what we are trying to do here at IDC Herzliya in the program that you participate, the Counter-Terrorism program.
Winston Churchill said that the worst form of government has been democracy, except for all the others that have tried. So I agree with what you're having to say, and clearly Winston Churchill also agreed with what you were saying there. Before we close off the program here, wanted to ask you quickly, very importantly, come September 11th, it's 5.5 weeks away, approximately 6 weeks away. Actually, 2 months, sorry, 8 weeks away. And that is the annual Herzliya Terrorism Conference hosted by the ICT here at the IDC. What could students, what could colleagues, academics, people, journalists, everyone expect to learn out of this particular conference coming up? And how can people, I guess we'll go on from there.
This is a very unique gathering. It's an annual gathering, always on the week of the 11th of September, because we want to memorize the biggest terrorist atrocity ever. But it's very unique, because of the quantity, the number of people. We're talking about hundreds of experts coming from more than 60 countries, joining together for 4 days to listen to the most relevant and up-to-date lectures and to be engaged in discussions, closed room discussions, roundtable discussions, corridor discussions, you name it. The other thing that makes it very unique is the type of people that come. because usually you have either scholarly conferences, or you have business-oriented homeland security technologies conferences, and so on and so forth. Here you have all in the same compound for 4 days. So you have the best scholars in the world which are coming. You have decision makers, heads of states which are coming to that. You have heads of security services. You have chiefs of police. You have private sector, CEOs of companies that deals with counterterrorism. You have NGOs which are coming, and all of them are sharing their thoughts and changing views and ideas. We also conduct simulations and war games in trying to comprehend what will be the next challenges that we are facing. You can ask the people which are coming on an annual basis. People are practically write this week in their schedule and coming every year, because every year it changes, every year it's becoming bigger and more relevant. For us, for our students, this is a great source for mingling, for getting to know people. Our students are usually in the early stage of their career or their mid-careers, and they think about future career. That's the time, that's the place to be, because the opportunity is there. Just mingling with those people, getting to know them, might open the doors for bigger and a great career in the field of counterterrorism and homeland security.
This discussion has been extremely enlightening. I know our audience is sitting around and debating a lot of the things we have spoken about here on our program today. But most importantly, you are one of the world's foremost experts in this field. And I think it's very important for our listeners and anyone interested where they can pick up your book, specifically Global Alert, because these books, personally, I've read them. I've had the opportunity, thankfully, to listen to you on many different occasions, and it is always enlightening and educating. And I think our audience, it's very important for them to be able to pick up some of these topics that we didn't get to go in depth about as well. But there are chapters on all these things that we spoke about today, and people can get an opportunity to get more in depth and a better understanding.
Thank you, Itai. A little PR never hurts, you know. And yes, everything I spoke here and much more I elaborated in my books. The Counter-Terrorism Puzzle and Global Alert can be bought in Amazon and any other bookstores.
Perfect. Thank you, Sam Greenberg.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ganor. We appreciate you taking the time and, again, enlightening all our audience on this very fascinating subject, and a subject that will not be going away in the near future. And hopefully we can do this discussion again.
With pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.